Good morning. Today we have the pleasure to have with us two members of TACSI that will share their approach and experience in social innovation and co-creation. And who is TACSI? The Australian Centre for Social Innovation brings people into the heart of shaping their lives and society. Formed in 2009 as an initiative of the South Australian Government, TACSI is now an independent social enterprise working on projects and initiatives across Australia. Bringing together a unique and diverse team of people from all over the world, the staff at TACSI are all united in their commitment to developing new and better ways to build social and economic prosperity for all. The two TACSI team members that we have with us today are Chris Vanstone and Alazne Alberdi. I will briefly introduce them both. Chris Vanstone. Chris started his career designing biscuits and razors before transitioning into social innovation almost 20 years ago. As TACSI Chief Innovation Officer, he develops the internal and external social innovation practice, develops new approaches to stuff they've never done before, and connects people and projects. Naturally curious and always up for an adventure, Chris's superpower is making sense of the world around him, and is especially skilled at spotting patterns in what we do and weaving stories around them. His goal is to democratize innovation, and is always striving towards new ways to get important concepts into the world in ways that people understand. Alazne Alberdi. A trained industrial designer, Alazne spent her early career focused on designing products that make people's everyday lives better. Now, at TACSI, she uses her experience to design support programs for people facing challenges in their everyday lives. She's passionate about giving every single member of our society a voice, and strives to create support systems that help to carve out safe spaces for people suffering from injustice. A natural collaborator, she loves working in a team and building on her colleagues' perspectives and strengths to achieve a common goal.
Thank you both for joining us this morning, and I will hand it over to you so that you can start with the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to speak. I hear that you wanted practical, tangible examples of co-creation and social innovation. So Alazne and I will do our best to share those stories with you. We're coming to you from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people here in Adelaide, the local Aboriginal people. So I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, as we always do in Australia as we open our meetings on these lands. But we're in the town known as Adelaide in South Australia. And we're going to talk about projects like these that have been bringing together people in different ways to guide different kinds of public decision making, sometimes about services and systems and practice, and sometimes about policy and futures. And we'll talk to all of that. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes and then give you some time for discussion. There'll be two parts, and this is part one. And it's been very interesting to see the focus that Aranatsu Lab has on co-creation, because I think there's sort of three reasons why it's timely to do that. Of course, we're seeing a real decline for a long time now, many years, many decades, in trust between people and institutions, and in the belief that people have, citizens have, that institutions like the government can make good decisions on their behalf. I think at the same time we're seeing a increased recognition of the diversity of people, increasingly healthy conversations about diversity in race and sexual identity and gender identity, and the need to and recognition that one size doesn't fit all. Finally, I think the third point is that as more and more of this has been done, I think there's increasingly good evidence that co-creation of different kinds can work and can get to solutions that often professionals alone can't get to. So whether that's breaking new political ground through things like citizens' juries, or creating new kinds of solutions through things like code design. We'll talk a bit more about both of those. But I think there's also a word of caution. I think there's also an increasing evidence base that co-creation done poorly can break trust with communities. And so we're going to try and shed some light on perhaps how we think you can do co-creation well in its many different guises, as well as share with you some questions that you can reflect on and discuss. A little more about TACSI, perhaps, and this is a photograph from above my desk at TACSI. This is one of my favourite things. A colleague gave this to me about 6 years ago now, and it says, celebrating 5 years of making it up as we go. And that's 5 years of making up how to do social innovation and co-creation. And now we've been making that up for about 10 years. I just wanted to share that because I think it's very important that whilst there are some really good guidance and case studies out there, I think for all of us that are interested in developing new things in our local context, we have to take a bit of that creative attitude and try and experiment and fail and find out what kinds of approaches work in your context. So we'll share some of our things today, but you might see a different way to do this and achieve better results. And we're very much looking forward to learning along with you on this journey as well. This has already been some great conversations with your colleagues at Untitled Lab. So the Social Innovation, or TACSI as we call it, we're a not-for-profit social enterprise. There are about 30 people situated in Adelaide and Sydney and also in Alice Springs, and working nationally across Australia. And we've been doing that, as I said, for about 11 years now. We work in some different ways. So sometimes we build innovation capability. So we'll talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing, training the Victorian, that's a state in Australia, the state of Victoria, the sector there in mental health in co-design. Sometimes we work as innovation consultants, short, sharp projects. Alazne will talk about the work that we've been doing addressing youth isolation with the Government Department of Human Services. Sometimes we work as innovation partners, so on long journeys with organisations. So I'll talk a little bit about Our Town, which is a 10-year project to support communities to self-determine their own mental well-being. And sometimes we work as implementation partners, and we support organisations to start up and sustain new kinds of peer-to-peer services. And I'm going to start the story there with what we've been doing in Australia. We started 10 years ago with a program called Family by Family that's now just getting started in the UK as well. And our focus, if you're interested, is on mental health, on regenerative communities, on peer-powered services, on the future of home, so work on home and housing, and work on social R&D ecosystems, which I'll talk a little bit more at in part 2. We sometimes talk about what we do as people-powered innovation, and there are 3 sort of mindsets or principles or practices that we hold very dear and we think are very important to us. And people power is perhaps the most prominent of those, and that really means giving power to people who are often experiencing marginalization and creating the conditions for them to influence decisions, whether that's at a design stage or a delivery stage or an evaluation stage of a particular project or initiative. The other side of that is also looking after our people and recognizing that we're all humans and need good conditions around us to do our work, particularly in these times of COVID, where things can be a little stressful than they perhaps used to be. So story one, family by family. This was the first project I worked on in TACSI when I moved to Australia about 11 years ago. And it's something that was co-designed by families, including children. It's co-delivered by families, including children. And families have also played an important role as we scale and manage the quality of that program over time. It started by asking with a question, as much good innovation does start. And the question was, how can we enable more families to thrive and fewer to come into contact with child protection services? And we spoke to families about that, and they told us that more often than not, help came from somebody who had been through the same things that they were. Help came from people who'd been through the same things that they had, who spoke their language or used the same kinds of words, and was available on weekends and evenings. And so from this, we recognized that families experiencing hard times often found better support from other families rather than professionals. And with this insight in the co-design phase, we went on to prototyping a new kind of program that connected families with families to support each other through change. And that now, so it looks like this, very normal. It's whole families helping whole families. Focus on their goals and create the kinds of change that they want to create. So it's quite complex behind the scenes, and it's a platform. What we've created is a platform where families are the front line of change and professionals are in the background supporting them, being there if they need to be. But this has allowed us to meet the needs of a lot of families at a relatively low cost. And importantly, meet the kinds of change, support families to create the kinds of change that they couldn't get from professional services. Often we're working with families who aren't bad enough to engage with professional services, but also sometimes families who professional services haven't been able to create change for. And now that that program has moved to the UK, where unfortunately, in a way, we've seen that families are experiencing exactly the same kind of challenges. The Australian families have played a real role in training the UK families, the families that help, we call them sharing families, to in their role and to support them along that journey. So I like this story of co-creation because it talks about the different stages that and the different kinds and roles that citizens can play in the design phase, in the delivery phase, and also in the scaling phase of a program. And this is a very interesting experiment for me. I'm originally from the UK, and when I first moved to Australia and worked on the design of Family by Family, I was certain that it would never work in the UK because it was so different culturally, but it actually seems to be going quite well from what I understand. Alazne, over to you, and let me know when you need a next slide.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to speak in English. I could do it in Basque, but I kind of thought I would do it in English today. So thanks for having us. Very excited to be here with all of you and see very good friends and people that I know in the room. So as you all know, there are different ways of doing co-creation with people with lived experience. And I guess convening a co-design session is a well-known way of doing that for all of us. But today we wanted to share another way we involve people with lived experience to work alongside us at TACSI. So at TACSI, I believe we have quite a long history of designing with people, not for people. And as Chris shared, the family by family example, this involves like sharing power, prioritizing relationships, using participatory means, and building capability. So we understand that co-creation is a process of working with people to come up with innovative ideas that support better outcomes. And having co-researchers is one way to work in collaboration with communities. So what do we mean with having co-researchers? Co-researchers are people with lived experience in a challenge that we are working on, and they are people that are currently in they are not currently in paid roles related to the challenge, but they want to be part of responding to it. So I'm going to explain that with a project that we've worked in. So Chris, if you go back, yeah. So last year we worked on a project called First Responders, and the project intended to explore, develop, and demonstrate community-led responses to people experiencing mental health distress. So TACSI took a capability building approach to support young people to take on the role as co-researchers or peer researchers. And TACSI hired young people that had experience in mental health distress that were trained and supported by TACSI to take on the role in a safe and supported environment. So if we go to the next slide, Chris. So young co-researchers were really valuable because they had lived experience and knowledge about mental health, and they wouldn't normally be included in decision making. But having co-researchers as paid roles allowed us to build a relationship and work in an ongoing partnership with them. So it also legitimized the knowledge of people with lived experience as a professional contribution, making more valid influence into the service delivery and also policy transformations. So usually at TACSI, we would hire co-researchers as casual staff for the period of the project, and they would spend limited amount of time working with us, usually no more than 1 day per week, and sometimes much less than that. Next, Chris. So co-researchers were given different opportunities to play different roles in the project, depending on their skills, commitment, or the responsibility that they wanted to take. And some of them took part in co-design groups as participants, some others even as facilitators. Some others work alongside TACSI in a lived experience team, but also others took a more of a storyteller role in the different phases of the project. So next slide, please. Oh, I think there is something, go to the next slide. Next.
Not sure what's there. I think it's just loading.
That one. Yeah, so I guess at TACSI we believe that all work should have some form of partnership with people and communities impacted by the issue that we are working on. And the earlier this partnership begins, the better the outcomes. So in summary, co-researchers could be helpful, for instance, when we want community leadership, when community leadership is a priority, but the conditions are not there for community to lead without support. Or it could be also that we want to connect with people with similar lived experience. So this could be a similar age, gender, culture, experience. And having a co-researcher might create a safe space for others to get involved in the project. And this, we've identified that it's also really helpful if we are looking to increase the sustainability of the solutions, because co-researchers can also take on the opportunity to deliver the service in partnership with communities. But last but not least, I would also like to mention that we should only bring co-researchers if the conditions are right. So we also need to look into having time to develop good relationships, also making sure that we have the capacity to train and support their roles, and also create a safe space for co-researchers to feel supported. And last, and not least important, clients and founders are also need to be invested and genuinely listening and being led by lived experience. So I guess there needs to be a willingness to listen to what lived experience have to share.
Thanks, Alazne.
That's from me.
We're trying to give you here a little bit, just share some concrete examples so far. So Family by Family, a program designed and delivered by families. Alazne has just talked about co-researchers as one kind of way you can build lived experience into the team and have a design team that's that is co. And here I want to talk about, before we take a break for discussion, about I guess the place where we are currently experiencing in Australia the most energy and perhaps investment behind co-creation, and that's in the reform of Victoria's mental health system, and that's coming with real challenges and as well as great opportunities. So recently, the government produced something called a Royal Commission into the Victoria's mental health system. It's a report that sort of puts forward 65 recommendations for reform. Those reforms, just to give you a flavour, it's worth about 2.36 billion euros, so it's quite a chunk of money, and about a third of those require that co-design or co-production or community-led work is part of it. So it's actually quite a significant commitment to this new practice that is still at the fringes and emerging. And you have a mainstream government department and a sector that's really trying to embrace this new way of working, which is really exciting. And we're getting to work with a lot of not-for-profit providers and the government themselves to build capability to do this. But it also comes with a number of challenges. And I just wanted to sort of talk about some of those, because there might be challenges that you see in your work in the Basque Country too. The first is, I think lots of people have come to us and say, okay, just tell us the steps to do this co-design or this co-creation stuff. Just make it really easy for us. But actually, there's lots of different ways you can do it, and they vary with the amount of power that's handed over to people. So you may be familiar with versions of this, but on the left-hand side, you have consultative processes where professionals are asking for input. In the middle, partnership processes where people are working side by side. I think this is the kind of work that Alazne was talking about with co-researchers. They're making the decisions alongside professionals. But also, and I'll go on to talk a little bit more about this in part 2, self-determined processes, where you're really building the capability of communities to lead their own change work. And I think that's the sort of the other extreme that we shouldn't forget when it comes to co-creation. I think you can make meaningful work at any stage along this spectrum, but it depends of change that you want to create. So I think on the left-hand side, it's generally easier to do. It fits better with business as usual, but it leads to more incremental changes. Whereas on the right-hand side, it takes a little bit more setting up, a little bit more specialist capability at the outset, not in the long term. But I think it leads to more radical shifts in power and more radical solutions that are sometimes more sustainable. So it's knowing what kind of co-creation you want to do. And one of those things is about ambition for change and the transfer of power. Another of those is what part of a cycle might you introduce co-creation? This is based on something called the co-production cycle, but you can co-plan, you can co-design. We've talked a lot about that. You can co-deliver solutions like Family by Family, and you can also co-evaluate. And there's different skills and capabilities involved all the way around that cycle. And as one of the things we wanted to share with you you can look more into if you follow the QR code there, is some patterns that we've put together, because there's lots of nuanced and practical ways that you can put this into practice, but it does take some skill and capability, and it's quite different to how we might often approach things. You might want to reflect back on these, but these are some questions that I like to give to organizations thinking about engaging in co-creation. And I think the first question is, what kind of conversations do you want to have? What can citizens authentically influence? Where in that cycle can participation add value? What approach fits our conversation and capability? So there's many different kinds of methodological approaches, but also what do you need to change about yourselves to have those good conversations? Because co-creation isn't only about pushing ideas out or bringing people in. It's also about changing ourselves so that we're more able to work with and the wisdom and the knowledge and the intelligence of citizens. So that might be changes in mind, changes in skill sets, changes in processes, or even changes to rules and resources. So if we're trying to create ecosystems for co-creation or social innovation, we've got to think about how we change all of these things. So we're going to switch to a little bit of discussion, I think, Yoni, for about 15 minutes or so. And these is sort of both a summary and a set of prompts for your discussion. So I think we see that co-design is actually getting some real traction in Australia as an idea, and perhaps a little bit less so, but also as a practice. We're seeing many new and lived experience-led and community-led initiatives appearing, sometimes funded by government, sometimes funded by philanthropy. There's also been, in the UK as well, sort of a few lived experience-led research institutes that have got started. But at the same time, we see that dominant mindsets and the conditions in the system present a real risk to growth. And a kind of question that organizations that are supporting co-creation need to ask is, what do they need to change about themselves? A few starting points for discussion, and over to you, Yoni.
Thank you both for your inspiring cases. It was really interesting to hear the different journey that you've been doing from self-determination and into the different examples. Ez dakit norbaitek galderari baldin badaukan.
Thank you, Chris and Alazne, for an inspiring presentation. You know, as Untitled Lab, we want to boost the collaborative governance as a new way to reinforce collaboration and relationships between public institutions and society and citizens as a whole. So I know you've been working with governments and public institutions. So from your experience, which are the main challenges or reasons why governments embrace co-creation as a new way of working to deliver higher impact or to bring people in? Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, a few reflections on that, why government might embrace co-creation. I think there's a few different reasons. I think often there are leaders that really get it and want to do it in some way. I think that's one important thing. So that sort of mindset shift is really important there. I think there are only a few people who are willing to create the time and space and energy to do that. I think the other place we're seeing change, like in the Mental Health Royal Commission, is because citizens have been advocating for it. In that case, consumers of mental health services have been saying you need to play a big role. So it's coming a lot and growing from advocacy from particular groups. You see the same in disability services in Australia. So I think a second place you also see co-creation is where there is a strong advocacy voice that is advocating for work to be done with them and with their insight into the problem rather than done to them. Interestingly, you don't see that where there's a weaker advocacy voice.
Hello. I would just like to ask about your experience in Australia or anywhere else. Now, often these experiences or the possibilities for co-creation all tend to crop up around public institutions, but they don't tend to crop up so much in the private sphere. So, not, for example, in the design of products or services. And it's harder, perhaps, to get it into the private sector. So I don't know if you've seen any examples of this in Australia, or is it really just in the public sphere? Have you got any examples of it happening in the private sphere? Private sector?
Very interesting question. So I would say, my training in Alazne as well is in product and industrial design. And so many of I would argue in some ways the practice of co-creation is far more developed in the private sector than it is in the social sector, as is innovation. So I think it is often used in the way that it is creating creating new consumer goods that appeal and people will buy. So is it used to social? Not particularly. But I think there is a lot of it happening in the private sector in the service of consumerism, I guess. I think perhaps what's not happening is those sort of bigger conversations about the direction of particular industries or indeed sort of research and development efforts, for example, or I don't think we're having big conversations or good conversations about the direction of social media, for example, but we could be. Or the direction of public transport, of sort of cars and transport systems, but we could be. So I think, I would love the Australian public service to catch up with some of the private industry in Australia.
I would like to add as well that, for instance, we were involved on a project in the disability sector where we had 3 private organizations that deliver disability services come together to co-design actually a shared service. So that was funded by government, so they had a grant to do that. But for them, there was not they already had a mindset and they already saw the value on co-creating that service. So I would say they were not behind the public sector in order to take on that opportunity. So based on that, perhaps I wouldn't say that the private sector is behind in that sense.
But there is perhaps one very important difference. The private sector is often driven to do this because the people who buy its services and products, the people who use its services and products are the same people that buy them. And often in public services, those two things are separate. So government might pay for disability services, but the person with a disability doesn't necessarily will use them. The customer is separated in that way. So there's a real drive for innovation in the private sector of a certain kind. And part of the bigger picture is how do we create an ecosystem where there is that real demand and we're not seeing that separation.
Well, I was just thinking about something, and we've shared this idea, and we seem to be fairly on the same page. Over the last 20 years, when we've been talking about collaborative governance, we've been talking about different political culture, citizen engagement, participation, and how we understand all this. I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years now. But then it's interesting to get this idea of this relationship between professionals and non-professionals. That was very interesting. How can we go about working sort of get this way of working between professionals and non-professionals. And also, people who are there as volunteers almost, they're not getting paid. What do they get out of it? I mean, what's the exchange? I mean, what are they getting in return? So we were talking about that as well, because there's a lot of doubts about that, concerns, worries. And I think it's quite an important challenge. How do we convince these people? Who funds all of this? And then all this power, I mean, how is the power used and what for? And there is sort of quite a lot of concerns about that. Yes, there's a lot of things to think about in relation to this. When you're talking about engagement and participation, what do they get out of it, etc.
Reflect back on that. Were you able to hear it? Yeah.
Would you like to go, Chris? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I think those are great reflections. I think it is very important when we're engaging citizens in these kinds of processes to work out what the value proposition is for them, what they might get out of it. Sometimes, often as a default, we will pay people for their participation. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes they're looking for other opportunities. Very often the driving motivation is that they don't want other people to experience the same bad things that they'd experienced in their lives. So we very rarely, if ever, have a problem recruiting people to participate in these processes. But exactly the reasons why people engage are slightly different in every situation.
I'd like to add as well,
I'm going to speak in Basque now because I'm being given the opportunity to speak Basque, which is great. Now, in TACSI, we often think about what we're creating, what we're doing, or perhaps what people are getting in exchange, or whether it's information, sometimes it's knowledge that's being generated. And it's often, we do think about what we're offering to the people who are participating. We think about that a lot. And it needs to be two-directional, it needs to be bi-directional, it needs to go both ways. And when we're creating this space for collaboration, we need to make sure that both parties are happy and both parties are contributing and both parties are getting something out of it. It's not just a case of paying people, it's a case of creating value. Thinking about experiences. Sometimes someone who's gone through a trauma, actually it helps them to think about their trauma, to go through it, to help other people. It helps them to heal as well. So we think about that a lot. We think about the value that's being generated for everybody in this moment in which we work together. So, anybody else want to share any reflections? Hello, thank you very much. Well, we were talking about expectations and how important it is to manage expectations in these types of processes. Because sometimes the organisers, sometimes the administration or the government, sometimes the participants have expectations that aren't realistic. Or they don't really understand what the process is going to be like, or they think it's going to be something different, and then they find it's more difficult, that they have to learn a lot more, that it's going to take a lot more time than they thought, be more costly, more difficult. So managing expectations is difficult. It's not easy. And I would like to know what types of solutions you've found to help manage expectations at TACSI. Okay, so that was the question about managing expectations.
I can go.
So I think when it comes to expectations, there's a number of things to do. I think one is being really clear about what can be influenced through a particular process or not. You would be surprised actually how understanding citizens can be when they're inputting to a particular policy or service. They can really understand that the government has to, for example, has to meet this particular political obligation or is working within this particular funding envelope. People get that. It makes total sense to them. So I think sometimes when we try and make things too simple for citizens to engage with. So I think that's one part. And I liked your question because creating false expectations is one of the number one ways to break that trust relationship between citizens and people might be leading processes. So being very transparent and clear. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right as well. It does take change on the part of institutions and professionals, and I think that can be very, very, very hard to convey. I think that's where we have less success in conveying, because it's not until people really experience the process that that they understand what it takes and why you need to work in this way. But the mindset of sharing power with people, co-creation, is a direct affront to many of our dominant mindsets around things like hierarchy or professionalism, as well as things like racism and misogyny. So they're really deep in here sometimes. So overcoming that can be the harder bit of the work. And I think it's important to take an approach that you can deliver with rigor. I think if you go too far on the right-hand side of that spectrum, not having the resources and capabilities, you can really set yourself up for bad things and break a relationship. I'd rather start on the left-hand side and work towards the right.
Sorry, Chris, but maybe this question is more for Alazne, because I would like to know if you, the cultural difference between Australia, UK, or Basque Country, and to start with this kind of projects, do you think that you could be any kind of difference between both countries, or because I see that they are very successful, but maybe the culture of the people are pretty different.
Bai, nik esango neban.
Well, I would say, what I've seen from Australia, I would say that they're perhaps more open to experimentation than we are. In the Basque Country, I think she's talking about we in this case. That's what I'd say first of all. They're perhaps more open to experimentation. In the Basque Country, however, there's a long tradition of community building. There's a lot of citizen engagement processes up and running. I think that culturally, because we're a small region, a small country, there's a lot of collaboration and a long history of collaboration. So I think that in that sense, the Basque Country perhaps is slightly further ahead than Australia. And then those are the two things I think that I would say. In Australia, they're happier to experiment. They're kind of more open to experimentation. And so right from the word go, they have they're more predisposed to sort of finding a different way, doing something different. But then in the Basque Country, they have the advantage of having a long tradition of working together. But in fact, people perhaps are more reticent to try something new. So I think those are the things that I would say. But we need to change the mentality in the Basque Country, I think. We need to be more open to something new, and we need to bring that together with our predisposition to collaborate. So I think we need to move towards a more open-minded mindset. As Chris said, in TACSI, we've been working in social innovation for the last 10 years, trying to define it, or trying to define it at least, or trying to do something with it, making it up as we go along. No one has the right answer. There's no magic bullet, silver bullet. But I think that through experimentation, through trial and error, we're gradually making headway down this new road. We're trailblazing down this new way towards social innovation. Yeah, so just experimenting, trial and error, trying something new, that's the way forward.